Hi everyone, I'm Mark Ashley, and today I'm going to talk to you about autism and the ways that the differences between people with autism and people who don't have autism can affect everybody, but in particular I'm going to be advocating for people with autism and the ways that that can impact on mental health and inclusion as well. Just as a bit of background, I qualified as a speech and language therapist in 2010. My job title is speech and language therapist, but pretty much everything I do now is to do with autism. I did work in the NHS for a couple of years doing mainstream stuff, and that's where I discovered my passion for autism. Certainly in the area of the NHS that I worked in, I found that they say that they like people who are proactive and think outside the box, but when you actually do it, they tend to get a bit cross. So I now work independently, so I provide a service directly to families of children and young people with autism, so supporting with communication, learning, behaviour, mental health, a whole range of different things. I also happen to be an adult with Asperger's, so I have some personal insight into this. Some of what I'm talking about will be from personal experience, some of it will be from the experiences I've had working with other young people, or with young people with autism. Okay. I'm going to try and, as concisely as I can, define what autism is, because it's kind of enigmatic in many ways. It's not easy to define simply, but as concisely as possible, it's a lifelong condition which is congenital, which means it's there from the point of conception. As far as we know, it's almost entirely genetic, so any parents of autistic children can stop blaming yourselves immediately. It's related to differences in neurology, so if you put a person, Simon Baron-Cohen is a fan of doing this, if you put an autistic person in an MRI scanner, you'll see there are physical structural differences in an autistic brain compared to a neurotypical brain. By the way, when I use the term neurotypical, what I basically mean is people who don't have autism, or ADHD, or any other neurodiverse condition. Okay. So autism fundamentally affects the way that people communicate with and relate to people around them, and also how they experience the environment around them. So the way that often feels is that there's a bombardment of information. So autistic brains are not so good at filtering, so everything kind of comes in all at once. So that's, visual, auditory, all of your kind of five senses, but also the internal senses, proprioception, vestibular, all of that stuff is all kind of happening at once, and that can be very overwhelming. The result of that is that it's very difficult to process all of that information. So a lot of what gets missed is the social stuff, because the side effect of that is that the social rules and the social input is given a lower priority. So we tend not to be so good at learning the kind of rules and social conventions that other people just seem to get without needing to be told. So that can affect understanding of other people, so things like facial expression, tone of voice, understanding non-literal language, manners, rules of conversation, and things like that. The way that appears to other people, to neurotypical people, is that we can often appear quite insensitive, because sometimes we're a little bit too honest, say things as they appear to be, and not necessarily give it the nice sugar coating that people seem to enjoy. Whereas for us, that doesn't really work so well, because if things are too sugar-coated, we won't get it. We won't see through that and work out what you actually mean. That's not to say that it's possible to be too direct. Impossible to be too direct with an autistic person. It's tricky. Quite often when we do get overwhelmed and overstimulated by that constant bombardment, that constant input, we will seek time alone to decompress, to alleviate that overstimulation. Sometimes autistic people behave in ways that seem strange or inappropriate to other people, particularly sensory behaviours, or some of the social interaction can seem quite odd, because it can be very different. A common misconception is that autistic people don't want to interact and don't want to communicate. that couldn't be further from the truth. I have yet to meet any autistic people who don't want contact with anybody. The issue often is just that it can be so frightening and so overwhelming that it causes withdrawal, and we'll come on to that. You get the kind of, some of the classic things are the repetitive patterns of behaviour, the love of routine, and often that comes down to anxiety. Highly focused interests, so my special interest, as you can probably tell, is Nintendo, hence the tats. Sensory sensitivity as well, so we tend to be hypersensitive, so things can, the threshold is lower, so things can quickly become overstimulating. And in some cases as well, there's hyposensitivity, which is where, for example, if you've got vestibular hypersensitivity, that's when kids spin around and things like that. Not just kids, actually. And often there's a combination of hyper and hypo, which can make things confusing. So the culmination of all of that is that building relationships with people is really, really hard, because it's really complicated. When you actually break down interaction and communication into tiny little bits, which is often what my job consists of, you actually realise how complicated interacting with another human being is. And when you're actually in a position where you're trying to teach somebody how to do it, you realise just how complex it is. Something that most neurotypical people just take for granted. So this brings me to what I see as the fundamental problem of autism. And this could just as easily be called the problem of neurotypicality, because the issue actually is one of interfacing. It's about the way that neurotypical people and autistic people interact or interface with each other. Okay, so if you've got a whole load of autistic people in a room together, you will generally find that the ones who need space on their own will just have space on their own, and everybody else either doesn't notice or they think that's fine, or the ones who share some interests and are ready for some interaction will come together and do that on their terms. And obviously if you've got a load of neurotypical people in a room together, usually they're interacting just fine. So as individual groups, there's no problem. It's when neurotypical people don't understand the needs of the autistic person, or the autistic person doesn't understand the communication of the neurotypical person, and that's when you get problems. Now, traditionally, the problem has been localised within the person with autism. So, for example, if somebody were to say something to me sarcastically, it's very unlikely that I would realise that that's what they were doing, and I would probably take it literally. So, you could argue that that's my issue. I have a problem understanding sarcasm, and I need to resolve that problem. But interaction doesn't work like that. It's not about one person just flinging information at somebody else and they just have to deal with it. Interaction is bi-directional. And if there's a breakdown in that communication, it's on both parties to resolve that. If I'm not speaking loudly enough, I need to speak louder. But if you're not listening, so you don't take in what I'm saying, then you're not listening. It goes both ways. But maybe you're not listening because I'm boring. Maybe I need to be more interesting to engage you more. So it's not as simple as just saying this person doesn't understand this type of communication, so they just have to deal with it. It works both ways. So these problems occur because of those neurological differences in the brains of autistic and neurotypical people. A lot of it comes down to the perception, so what I said about the sensory stuff, and also perceiving the pertinent social cues. For example, going back to the example of sarcasm, to understand sarcasm you need to take in the verbal and the non-verbal communication, realise the discrepancy, that someone has said something with a tone of voice that didn't match what they said, and then realise they probably didn't mean that. And that's hard for people with autism. Also speed of processing, taking all of that in quickly enough. Sometimes you realise things later on and think, oh, that didn't sound like they meant it. By that point, the moment's gone and it's too late, and then you've missed an opportunity. And also, being able to leverage verbal and non-verbal communication simultaneously can be quite difficult for us as well. So, if I'm trying to be sarcastic, it generally doesn't work very well, and people think I mean what I say, which obviously causes a problem. So that makes it sound as, all of that makes it sound as though the problem is located in the autistic person's brain. There's something wrong with the brain, which is causing all of this. But it's a bit like if you go to a foreign country and just assume that they're going to speak English. if that is the language you're speaking. If you try to communicate with that person in that language and they don't understand, they might understand the odd word, but they're probably not going to really get what you're trying to say. So you have to establish a language that both of those people speak. So either you have to check, does that person understand English, or do I need to learn some of their language so that we can communicate? You don't go to that country and think, well, you don't understand my language, there's something wrong with you, or I don't understand your language, there's something wrong with me. The issue is that there's a breakdown in the communication between both of those people, and it's incumbent upon both to establish a way of communicating with each other. To give you an analogy of how this works socially, take the example of someone who is a wheelchair user. They may not be able to access a particular environment because there are steps there and there's no ramp. Where's the problem there? Is it in the person who can't walk? Is it the problem with their body? Or is the problem with the chair, because the chair is not adequate for going up and down stairs? Or is it in the environment, because there's no ramp? Or is it in the people who created that environment because they didn't think about the needs of that person? It's actually the lack of the ramp which causes the problem. It's not the fact that that person is in a wheelchair. If there were ramps everywhere, then being in a wheelchair wouldn't be considered a disability. So what we do in society is we put ramps up. And it makes it easy for those people. I'll come back to that idea in a few moments about accommodation. So the overall effect of all of this for people with autism is huge anxiety, generally. The world can be a very overwhelming and overstimulating place just from the sensory perspective. But once you add people into that, people are much more unpredictable, much more overwhelming. So society is limited by the difficulty in that interface with a world which is geared up for neurotypical communication. Got some statistics about that. Anxiety disorders. General population is about 15% will experience an anxiety disorder. In the autistic community, it's 40%. Rate of OCD in the autistic population is double what it is in the neurotypical population. Depression in the general population is about 20%, and it's up to 65% in the autistic community. Suicide ideation is 9% in the neurotypical population, and for adults with Asperger's syndrome, it's as much as 66%. I can't actually find any figures on suicide rates in the autistic community, but 90% of suicides, actual successful suicides, are believed to be related to depression. So when you consider that there's 53% more depression, 45% higher rate of depression in the autistic community, you can imagine that they're at high risk of suicide. So this happens, these issues of anxiety, depression, all those other issues happen because autistic people have to try so much harder to fit into the world, which is tailored for neurotypical people. This can be frightening, frustrating, unfulfilling, and despite our best efforts, we're often told you're doing it wrong. You didn't understand. Your expression was inappropriate. You shouldn't feel that way. Your interests are too unusual. Your behaviour is strange. Imagine how it would feel if that was the narrative of your life, if you were constantly receiving those messages that the way that you are was fundamentally wrong. And we've heard this from other speakers today, that parts of people's identities that are very fundamental to who they are being undermined, or being cast as aversive or wrong or dangerous. Think what that would do to your feelings of self-worth, your self-esteem. You can easily see how it could lead to depression, anxiety, all those kinds of things, social isolation. Unfortunately, therapy often aims to highlight the impairment and try and teach skills so that autistic people can pretend they can behave as though they are a neurotypical person, so they can fit in, which is what we've heard again from other speakers. So, going back to the analogy of the wheelchair, we don't expect wheelchair users to stay at home and say, oh, sorry about all the stairs everywhere, you probably better stay in. No, we put ramps in, and we should be doing the same thing for people with autism. We should be understanding and accepting and accommodating those differences. Just because the problem isn't physical, it's about communication. That doesn't mean we can't make accommodations. The accommodations are about communication. It's about clarity. It's about tolerance. It's about understanding that just because something is different, might seem strange, or it might need further explanation, doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that it's different. That kind of accommodation can be harder for people with autism because we find it harder to see other people's perspectives. So it can feel a bit one-sided. So it can sometimes feel like you're doing all the work, accommodating our needs. But just try to remember that the effort that it might take you to make a small change to your communication to help us to be included would be matched by a huge amount of effort to make a smaller change on our part. It's harder for us to do this. But we need you to meet us in the middle, because if it's just us trying to be like you and trying to pretend to communicate in a way that isn't natural for us and to pretend to understand things that don't really make sense to us, all that does is makes us feel more outside of the little neurotypical bubble, makes us feel more like we're not normal and we're not part of your world, when we want to be. But we want to be on equal terms, not as an outsider trying to break in. We want to feel accepted and welcomed, and not as though you're just going along with it as long as we behave ourselves. It's not really fair. So those autism ramps can be inconvenient. There's a ramp outside the school here. If anyone walked down the ramp to get in today, you probably know it's quite uncomfortable to walk down a ramp. Stairs are easy for people with fully working legs. So just like wheelchair users don't say, right, let's get rid of all the stairs, all the able-bodied people have just got to deal with ramps all the time. Just got to walk up and down the ramps. Autistic people aren't saying we need all of our needs to be accommodated all the time. It's a compromise. Autistic and neurotypical people share the same environment often, but for the autistic people it's often very uncomfortable, can be overwhelming, frightening, overstimulating. So it needs to be a compromise, finding a way of making that environment manageable and enjoyable and effective to the greatest extent possible for everybody who's using that environment. I'm not saying that we need to change the whole world to fit the people with autism. I'm saying that small changes can make a big difference. Because very often, people with autism are prepared to change and learn, but we need you to do the same. When this happens, what you see, or what you feel, is a huge drop in anxiety. The reason for that is because mutual understanding means that person's able to be who they are, not feel that they have to pretend, and it's not so much effort to try to fit in, and you feel accepted and welcomed and loved because of who you are, not in spite of it. Relationships can take on new meaning because mutual appreciation creates respect between people. When you're in a relationship with somebody as a friend or a partner or in a professional capacity, when you can appreciate the differences between each of you, you can start respecting those differences rather than trying to circumvent them or mitigate them. You can actually enjoy them. That kind of fulfillment can reduce a lot of the depression and anxiety that we tend to feel. And then happier and better understood autistic people be welcomed into society and have more opportunities for social contact, which is the very thing that we're often believed not to want. And then the advantage for neurotypical people is that you benefit from the skills and abilities that we have, the unique perspective that we often have. I'm not really a fan of saying, oh, Albert Einstein was autistic or Isaac Newton was autistic, because those people died a long time before the diagnosis existed, and we don't really know enough about those people. But there are a lot of autistic people who have unique perspectives and have ideas and interpret things in ways that neurotypical people don't. And we need that diversity in society, and we need that in our relationships and in our culture. It's all part of the spectrum of all types of identities that we have. And just as we wouldn't expect any other minority group to feel marginalised, autistic people shouldn't either. The other issue is that for autistic people, self-advocacy can often be very difficult because of the communication difficulties. So speaking up for our own rights is often very difficult. So sometimes it means we need, educated and well-aware neurotypical people to do that on our behalf, which is why I'm here today. I want to finish with a quote by one of my favourite autistic people, Wen Lawson, who has some very interesting ideas on autistic differences, autistic brains, and is also gathering evidence about some overlap between autism and sexuality and gender identity. So that overlaps really well with some of the other things that have been spoken about today. So Wen says, Wen is also a transgender man, so his ideas come from personal experience as well. So Wen says, I believe that mutual ground can be found, that bridges of communication can be built, and the differences that separate the two worlds of autism and neurotypicality can become assets that will enrich the lives of those who take the journey. This is coming from an autistic person, and what he's saying is, we want to be included, we want to be part of this neurotypical world around us, we want to have the opportunity to be included within that. But it's got to come from both sides. It's got to be mutual understanding, mutual acceptance and mutual respect in order for that to happen. The risk, if it doesn't, is all of those things that I said before, the issues for the autistic person, and the lack of the opportunity to share in those experiences for the neurotypical people. So I think the main message that I would hope that you'd all take away from this is that even though it may seem that autistic people want to be distant, want to be alone, and don't want to be included, very often it's just that when we try, we get pushed back, or we get told we've done it wrong, or that we failed. And that is so undermining. And all it teaches us is, don't bother trying. So, what I would hope is that neurotypical people can learn to accept those differences and to enjoy them and to respect them and to try to understand us so that we can all enjoy each other.